Andre stood and waited for the most important thing from the director of this wandering tent. What has happened in this realm of horror, if even the manager himself can't say anything about it? Well, and what happened next? I don't have time to stand here and pull out a confession with ticks, the expert exclaimed with difficulty restraining impatience. And then this tramp assigned to the girl began to behave strangely, the circus director began. How strange? What was it expressed in? Is it possible to be more specific? Alfred Stone took another sip of whiskey, then continued, this poor fellow has turned as pale as death itself. You may not believe me, but during the time he devoted to this creature in a glass cube, he lost at least 10 pounds. And maybe even more. After that, he literally began to stagger in the wind, and one day, he simply collapsed on the floor right during the feeding of this reptile. I decided to find out what was the matter. I followed him and found out that this idiot feeds her with his blood through cuts in his hands. Just imagine. There was a tense silence in the office, which made it seem that you could catch the heartbeat of a fly flying by. And what did you do? Andre asked, stunned. To begin with, I gave this fool a good beating with a billiard cue. I love this business, you know. Not a beating, of course. And billiards. I beat him, and he begged to let this girl go free, you know? There was madness in the idiot's eyes. At first I didn't understand what was going on, and then I realized that he was fascinated by this creature. This happens when people with weak will obey someone who is much stronger than them. Of course, not only did I not release this girl, but I continued to use her for my own purposes. It would have been better if I had personally killed this cowboy, his mother. You see, he's completely out of his mind. This tramp got poison from somewhere and, having drunk it to the brim, decided to give his poisoned blood to this beast from a glass cube. I'm sure she didn't know about it because she was so drunk. Well, then, I went into the room and saw 2 corpses. Of course, I didn't need the whole blood-feeding mess. Therefore, I buried the cowboy in the field so that no one would ever find him. And he called the police and said that the girl died of artificial starvation. Like, I didn't eat anything. How could I have known that in the morgue, her body would be disassembled to the bone, the director said and exhaled with relief, as after a heavy confession. A possible scenario for the development of events immediately began to line up in Andre's head. Now, it became clear to him that the man who succumbed to the influence of the girl in the glass cube simply took a lethal dose of thallium. After that, he cut his hands in several places in order to feed Sarah with poisoned blood and die with her together. It sounded so creepy that Andre's brain refused to believe that a girl in a glass cage could force a guy to go crazy from unrequited feelings. At the same time, having subdued the poor fellow to her will, Sarah Johnson did not even realize that the tramp wanted to give her freedom by dying from poison. I see. I was not mistaken. Your circus was really doing some shit. You shouldn't have told the police the truth. Although, I understand. After this, your circus tent would be closed forever, Andre said with contempt. The medical examiner had no desire to communicate further with this half-drunk fat man. After leaving the location of the traveling circus, Andre felt some relief. A young expert was able to understand the motives of a guy whose will was suppressed by a beauty living in a glass cube. In principle, everything looked logical. But who would want to kidnap her body while killing a morgue guard and a chemical analysis specialist? Andre thought on the way to the house. The guy understood that there was only one link missing in this whole chain in order to unravel this sinister tangle, from which death and corpses reeked a mile away. Andre opened the front door and entered the walls of his home with relief. Now, he was no longer afraid of all these conversations about poisons and blood in the stomach of the deceased. But before Andre had time to take off his casual clothes and take a shower, his smartphone announced the silence of the room with the trill of a bell. The expert glanced briefly at the screen and involuntarily shuddered. The caller was the head of the Bureau of Forensic Medical Examination. Hello. Andrew. In general, here's the thing. Fingerprint specialists took fingerprints from the bodies of a security guard and a chemical expert. So, as it turned out, after death, the bodies were turned over, and therefore, for this reason, there were prints on the skin. Benjamin Lopez began. And what? Are there samples in the database? Who exactly do they belong to? Andre asked, trembling with tension. The program showed a 100% match. Justin left them, you know? Most likely unintentionally. Maybe he touched the bodies this morning? I don't want to make a fuss prematurely, but still it's unpleasant in my heart. It casts a shadow over the entire bureau. Justin left work early for some reason. His phone is silent. I don't know what to think, Mr. Lopez replied. Well, what can I do to help? I'm a medical examiner, not a detective, Andre objected. And you look at it from the other side. Your colleagues. So come to him, chat about this and that over a bottle of something hot. Otherwise, if I give the data to the cops, then Justin will be accused of all mortal sins, you know? I can't afford it, because I worked side by side with his father for 25 years. In general, find out what and how. So as not to make a fuss. Andre shook his head, after which, almost without hesitation, he gave his consent. To allow Justin to be accused of something he didn't do was piggish, and the expert understood this like no one else. Justin lived in a cozy house located in the most prosperous area of New York. Having bought a bottle of strong gin, Andre called a taxi and went to visit a colleague. Even when he drove up to Justin's house, he saw that the blinds on the windows were lowered, which used to be extremely rare. After paying the taxi driver, Andre went to the front door. Despite the fact that nothing special had happened yet, he felt uncomfortable. All this time, Andre still had an oppressive sense of danger, which made his receptors sharpen to the limit. But when, after knocking on the door, Justin appeared on the threshold, the guest visibly relaxed and discarded all doubts, went inside. What do I owe you, my friend? Justin asked casually. Trying to avoid a direct answer as tactfully as possible, Andre slapped a paper bag with his hand, which immediately responded with a characteristic gurgle. Ah, well, then it's clear. Come into the kitchen, Justin drawled indifferently and closed the door by 2 turns of the lock. The metallic click of the locking mechanism made Andre shudder and look back. But before, when Justin was at home, he never locked the door during the day. Why such precautions? The expert thought, but did not say it out loud. Leaving Andre at the table, the owner of the house asked for a couple of minutes, after which he locked himself in a room from which some noise was periodically heard. At the same time, the guest could not help but notice the deathly pallor of Justin, whose eyes were burning with fire. From the outside, it seemed that the guy was sick with some incurable disease that literally devoured him from the inside. The most interesting thing was that the pallor appeared quite recently. But really? Justin changed after that incident in the morgue, Andre thought. The young expert did not have time to complete his conclusions, because the owner of the house soon returned and sat down opposite him. Andre involuntarily stopped looking at his colleague's hands, and could not help noticing the traces of manipulations with a medical needle on the elbow bends of his hands. What have you got there? Are you sick with something? The expert asked cautiously. I picked up some kind of infection. A little feverish, Justin answered, as if expecting this question. He hardly touched the gin poured in a glass and behaved quite differently from usual. Andre understood right away that his work colleague was lying. Justin's lie sounded so wild that he felt uneasy from such a brazen deception. I wonder what is hiding there, in the room. And why is the door to it constantly closed? Andre thought and, as if by chance, got up from the table. Still holding a glass of gin in his hand, the young expert approached the door and was about to take hold of the handle when he heard Justin's angry voice behind him. Don't even think about it. Do you hear? I won't let you take her away. This is my fiancée. There, in the dark of the morgue. She kissed. Goosebumps ran down Andre's back. He knew that Justin lived alone and the guy just couldn't talk about someone in such a tone. Deliberately ignoring the warning of the owner of the house, Andre jerked open the door and immediately, a barely perceptible smell of decomposition smelled in his face. But worst of all, it wasn't even that, but what he had to see inside. In the middle of the room stood a girl dressed in a white wedding dress, which in the area of the abdomen was heavily smeared with blood and something else, the origin of which Andre could not determine. The girl was pale as chalk and looked at the guest through a translucent veil, behind which her features could hardly be guessed. Why did you come in here? You can't see my fiancé, Justin pleaded somewhere behind him. Still not believing his eyes, Andre looked around the room and saw the containers with blood, from which the flagella, taken from the dropper system, were moving away. Already guessing whose blood was in these vessels, the guy felt sick and trembling in his hands. Andre's brain refused to believe in what was happening before his eyes here and now. Meanwhile, the bride jerked off the veil and the guest, already guessing what he would have to see, instinctively leaned back. Under the veil, there was Sarah Johnson, on whose chin there were drops of blood. The lips of the deceased were distorted in a devilish grin, which most of all resembled the snarl of a predatory creature. The pupils of the bloodsucker narrowed to the size of a coal ear. The pallor of her face could only compete with lime, which was sprinkled on rotting corpses at all times. Andre didn't even doubt that Justin had lost his mind from eye contact with this sheet devil. Now, it became clear to him who opened the building of the Bureau of Forensic Medicine and released this creature, which arrived in the States from a remote Peruvian village. But even earlier, Andre personally released this creature into the wild, cutting through her stomach with a scalpel and getting rid of the blood infected with poison. Since Justin was of no use at the moment, Andre could only count on himself. The devil spawn in the bride's outfit looked worse and worse every second, as if the regeneration processes in her tissue suddenly slowed down, and decomposition on the contrary increased several times. Strange sounds were suddenly heard from her mouth, which were pronounced in some dialect unknown to Andre, most likely Peruvian. At the same time, a loud female voice sounded in the head of the medical examiner, which instantly threw his thoughts into confusion and tried to subdue him to his will. Justin, who was standing next to him, could not stand such a mental onslaught and fell to his knees in front of the devil. Andre's mind turned out to be a little stronger, and with the tenacity of a doomed man continued to resist the attack of a creature as pale as death itself. Thoughts and images flashed through the head of the medical examiner, which forced him to obey with all possible onslaught. Andre's hands reached out to the scalpel on the table by themselves in order to hide the veins and give this reptile his blood. Resisting her will with the last of his strength, the guy realized the full power of the otherworldly essence, which gained strength only after it began to feed on human blood. Before that, the abomination drank only animal blood, but after tasting human blood, she felt a surge of incredible, hellish energy. Backing away under the onslaught of the ghoul, Andre was able to reach the kitchen, out of which, most likely, he was no longer destined. Realizing the futility of the mental attack, the creature attacked Andre with all possible fury, striving to tear his throat and send him to the next world. Bleeding profusely, the guy tried to cover the artery with one hand, and with the other grope on the table for something suitable for self-defense. As if, in mockery, there was only that same half-opened bottle of gin, with a strength of more than 40 degrees, on the corner of the table. There was no time to think and the guy went all in. Having brought it down on the head of the Peruvian creature, Andre unwittingly doused it with a combustible mixture, which, although inferior to gasoline, burned well too. The matches were tight, but the medical examiner knew they had to be lying there somewhere. Pulling off the tablecloth with a weakening hand, Andre clearly discerned the shine of the metal Zippo of the owner and rushed to it with the last of his strength. With disobedient fingers trembling with fear, the guy struck the wheel of the lighter and, rejoicing in the flame, threw the burning thing at the damned creature, which, in the bride's dress soaked in a combustible mixture, flared up like a torch. The house immediately resounded with a loud howl, which absorbed all other sounds with its tonality. Seeing the burning creature, Justin rushed to extinguish the flames, pressing his whole body against it. To say that it was his fatal mistake meant to say nothing. At the same second, the fire engulfed two bodies that were entwined in a deadly embrace, which, after a large-scale fire in the house, quite naturally transferred their ashes to hell. After leaving the burning building, Andre fell on the lawn and, closing his eyes, tried to forget everything that was happening. The guy did not want to discredit the name of his colleague, and he sincerely hoped that the fire would destroy all traces of the cursed creature that feeds exclusively on blood. Andre had to forget about this incident forever and bury the memories of this tragedy in the depths of his memory. And only thanks to his frankness, we were able to find out the details of this terrible story on my channel, friends.